Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to a TMC Roundtable session. We're going to focus today on the cultural orientations approach and really focus on realizing strategic performance in the VUCA world. So thank you for joining. I am joined today by my two colleagues and panelists, Jorg Schmitz and Karen Walsh. Let me ask you guys to come off mute real quick and just say hello, introduce yourself, and then we'll get started.
Greetings to all.
Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, this is Jorg. Hello to everyone. Thanks for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Aish. And my name is Lynn Putz. I'm so excited to have you joining us today. We are going to work through a couple of the newest thought processes that TMC has evolved around cultural competence development. And we're pleased to have issued our 6th edition of our book last year. And we want to kind of illustrate today some of the changes that we have developed in this latest iteration of the Cultural Orientations Guide. And really the Cultural Orientations Guide moves us in the Cultural Orientations approach, which is our certification, into a couple of different phases. First, we discuss the challenges of achieving the strategic performance in a business environment. And these, times are extremely trying for all of us. The situations are volatile across the geographies that we're working in. The business climate is uncertain with the different influences that are happening on supply chains and on the business environment in general. It's complex to work across those borders, across those differences, across organizational structures with merger and acquisition and joint venture. And ambiguous is the new norm, where it's not a clear path to any goal anymore. We have to be very, very deliberate in our agility and being able to navigate those situations on a case-by-case basis as they come up. And our navigation has to be minute by minute rather than year by year. So our VUCA environment is becoming more and more relevant for us, and so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. We're going to present a comprehensive cultural perspective that we've brought over 31 years with TMC, and we've evolved that today in today's environment to relate to the VUCA environment in particular. We want to review the critical mindset and skills necessary to adapt to the very changing environment that we're operating in on a daily basis, and we want to illustrate some practical applications. So at the end, and in fact we'll reserve the last 20 minutes for some case studies that we have brought to the table today. So excited to jump into those. Just a real quick poll to see who's on the line with us today. So we're really interested in understanding who's on the line. What's your organizational role? Is it talent management, organizational development, training, business line leader, or other? And if it's other, go ahead and use the question box to let us know. All right, so Lakeisha, let's see who's on the line. All right, so we have mostly other on the line. We do have some talent management, organizational development, and training. We don't have any business line leaders on the line today. So great, we'll take a look at the question box to find out who our additional participants are today. Really appreciate that. And we're really focused on understanding the strategic performance framework and really moving us into a space where we are comfortable influencing, collaborating, negotiating, and communicating across differences. So you'll see on the screen that you're looking at right now, on the far right side are those absolute necessary hard skills that get us to strategic results. And if I move you from right over into the middle of this model, you'll see that these are the skills that are necessary in order for us to actually enact influencing, collaborating, negotiating, and communicating. And these are what we call the 4 key cultural skills. Absolutely vital for us to enact cultural competence in the workplace to get to strategic results. Now, let me move you one step farther to the left, and that's where we really begin, is an open attitude, developing self-awareness, having that introspective lens that lets us understand self more deeply so that we can then begin to understand the others that we're working with. We can navigate those differences more effectively. We can look for synergistic energies, and we can develop new cultural perspectives because of that. So if you look at this model from left to right, right to left, this is a dynamic environment, and you see that arrows go both to the right and to the left, so they go forwards and backwards. I know when I moved to India in 2007 and lived there for 3 years, I moved all the way back to my first ring on the left-hand side, and I had to come with an open attitude, and I had to work very hard on that, actually, to develop that open attitude so that I could be more aware of what I was bringing to my interactions with my Indian colleagues. And that's that self-awareness so that I could then develop other awareness so I could hone my skills and then move into effective communication and negotiation and influencing. So that's, kind of my journey through this process. It's definitely been forward and, moving to the left and to the right through this model as I have dynamically been adapting to the new environments that I have been in. So I wanted to kind of, give you the level set of what we're going to do today and how we're going to introduce the strategic performance framework. What I'd love to do is have Jorg talk a little bit about the cultural orientations approach and just give some historic perspective on it, because I think it's really important to see where we have emerged from to know where we're going and heading into the future. So let me hand that over to you, Jorg.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned, Lynn, a couple of things that I think are absolutely critical and that we've seen over the years across so many organizational environments, namely the requirement to dynamically adapt, to differences out there in the marketplace, in our workforce, and so forth. So the question then becomes, what exactly is this cultural orientations approach, and how does it help us and our organizations dynamically adapt, and how does it address actually this particular dilemma or challenge that we all face? So first of all, it is we've designed this, I think, over many years, of just piecing different pieces together to become a comprehensive system that is academically grounded, methodologically and otherwise, in the development of cultural competence, which of course is essential for that dynamic adaptation that you talked about. So it's really, as a system, when you think about it, it's a combination of an online platform, the Cultural Navigator, a customizable learning solutions, and then of course paired with certification options for internal practitioners, so that together with, high touch and high tech, you're encircling an organization and its members to develop the ability to dynamically adapt at multiple different levels. What holds this whole thing together is a framework around well-established, well-researched dimensions of cultural differences, and we brought to this an anthropology-based understanding of culture, and we'll talk about this perhaps a little further, and you may have some questions about this, but also linking it very mindfully to what we know about emotional intelligence, as well as the latest discoveries in neuroscience. And Karen, particularly, you have done a lot of work in the connection to neuroscience. So, essentially we are bringing together all these different strands into a system that enables dynamic adaptability. And, and how do we do that, you may ask? What kind of problems do we solve with this type of approach? And one of them is that organizations, in order to make this part of how we operate, need a proven and scalable system as well as tools. So it's no longer enough to just have individual leaders with those skills. You need to make it organizational and systemic, and that's I think what this particular system enables. We need to support learning and a process of creating inclusive organizations. And when we say inclusive, of course, this means processes, practices, norms that are shared by members of an organization that really leverage the cultural differences. And you know, that becomes, of course, a huge challenge both on a societal level, on an organizational level, and sometimes an individual level as well. And through doing that, we are helping leaders to focus on the cultural aspects of performance, which in so many ways, whether we tap a new market, whether we create the right culture that engages our employees that are multicultural or diverse, or whether we are tapping new market opportunities somewhere, or creating internal efficiencies in our organization, this whole issue of culture is just you know, a significant force that we need to factor into our leadership strategies, and that's what we want to enable in this approach.
And I think it's a wonderful approach and a great opportunity for us to prepare for the VUCA environment. And Karen, you've done a lot of work studying VUCA and its effects on specifically negotiations, but I wonder if you might want to talk a little bit about this and bring in your neuroscience aspect too. That's always very interesting. Karen?
Some of you might have already seen this term VUCA in some of the reading you've done. In particular, in our book, we've actually done some work with this and linking it more specifically to why, as human beings, our nervous systems can become disillusioned and disturbed when there is a lot of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity around us, as Lynn had mentioned in the very first slide. And those of us who study leadership have actually borrowed something from the military. In the 1990s, in a lot of the early literature, it was looking at this notion in organizational behavior and in military command to move away from a very hierarchical and paternalistic approach to leadership and to strategy in particular, because of the various changes that have been happening on the security field. And in fact, a lot of these same dynamics are impacting us in the international markets, the economic markets, and even social markets in terms of how fast things are moving. And it basically means that the leader moves from having strict control and command to increasing the opportunity for freedom in planning and execution at the field level. So this creates a lot of anxiety at the individual level and at the different levels of leadership in terms of what are the ways I can be more certain in these situations. And what we have found is that this approach toward understanding our personal and cultural conditioning and our own preferences actually is wired in our neurology. So when we are faced to have to make decisions very quickly, there's a lot of uncertainty and complexity, this role of using the COI as an example to tap into our subconscious or our unconscious to give us a little more clarity. And this will help us understand what our preferences are and how we can then learn to style switch and get dialogue and to become more certain. So we find that the antidote to this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is to use VUCA Prime. And that is, how can we have more vision in terms of where we would like to go and what our brand is, then understanding our own cultural preferences and those of our counterparts. How do we maintain more clarity in terms of neither fixed time or fluid time, for example, is right or wrong in a negotiation, but how do we have more clarity about where the gaps might be? And then how can we have style switching or adaptable or agility in our behavior itself? So this is what we are finding in negotiation, in organizational development, as companies are moving from maybe they may say they are international enthusiasts and have businesses and parts of their business all over the world. Today we're finding a lot more global restructuring. So if you're going to have all of your global IT in one part of the world, so you can be a lot more adaptable, so you can reach the global market. It's going to take a lot more uncertainty for those in those markets. And what we find is these tools can help with that individual level, the organizational level, and then with the global level of quick adaptability in a very uncertain situation.
And you know, the most recent book that kind of illustrates the VUCA environment and how it has been navigated most effectively is by General McChrystal. He just released The Team of Teams. I'm sure you guys have read that book as well, but it's really trying to navigate the new environment of, you know, an agile military being able to respond to dynamic environments that they are having to respond to now with a military force that they're up against that is dynamically shifting and moving all the time. So this is definitely an environment that we find ourselves in the business world as well. And in fact, we have just one slide that helps kind of illustrate the interesting times that we live in, and the population growth by region is just one way to look at how different the world is shaping up to be. So this slide represents 1950, 2014, and 2050 estimated population shifts across the world. And you'll see that the blue represents Asia, the red represents Europe, green LATAM, purple North America, and a light blue is Africa. And you see in 1950, Africa doesn't show up at all on these population shifts. 2014, it's starting to emerge on the far right. 2050, it's double that size. You also notice that Europe is shrinking in terms of population growth. 1950 to 2014, it's 1/4 of the size. By 2050, there's predicted to be a negative population growth rate, about a -2% population growth rate in Europe. And so as we present this to business leaders and managers who are, you know, trying to figure out where the next market is that is untapped or needs to be approached with a new service or a new product, they're looking at this saying, wow, I'm not sure that we're ready. I'm not sure that we have prepared our workforce. I'm not sure that our workforce mirrors the markets that we're needing to understand in the next, you know, 10, 15, 20 years. So this is really just one of the ways that we're seeing leaders look at the emerging VUCA environment. Another way is on the bottom you see the GDP comparison. So in 2014, the GDP gross domestic product rating, number 1 is US, number 2 is China, 3 India, 4 Japan, 5 Germany. 2030 predicted by PricewaterhouseCoopers and the World Bank indicate that China is going to be number 1, which it almost is already, and US number 2, India 3, Japan 4, Russia taking over 5. And then in 2050, again, you see some changes, at least in the 4 and 5 position. You see China, US, and India remaining, but you also see Brazil and Japan. Japan moving down 1 slot, Brazil coming out of nowhere. So very interesting. This is dynamic information that is constantly shifting, but to keep your eye on this, to keep, you know, this on your radar screen. If any of you have read or are fans of Ram Charan, The Attacker's Advantage is a great book that kind of, you know, talks about how to confront this VUCA environment, attack it, and be ready for it in a way that perhaps we hadn't been before, because perhaps we're doing 3 to 5 year plans rather than 1 to 3 year plans, or the next 6-month plan for our business environment as it's shifting so aggressively. So I want to move us from kind of the VUCA environment and kind of grounding us in how dynamic our environment is to the cultural orientations approach again. And again, our historian and our legacy anthropologist that has been you know, proudly affiliated with TMC for many years, Jorg, could kind of walk us through the evolving perspective that we have had on culture, and nobody can say it as beautifully as you, Jorg. You want to take this one, huh?
Well, I'm not sure if I can say it beautifully, but I'll spend some time on it. I think what is important about, I mean, just going back to, and I mean, to this VUCA environment, I was just thinking we were looking at these beautiful predictions, and one thing that we know is actually that with more uncertainty and volatility, our powers to predict actually become less and less accurate. So I'm not sure what that means for these predictions into 2030 and 2050, but it's certainly a different environment. And even if we think about, for a moment, where does traditionally our cultural knowledge come from, or our cultural awareness? Where does research in the intercultural space, if you just look at it from an international perspective, which is only one level of culture, then certainly we know a lot more about parts of the world that are shrinking in power and in size, and some parts of the world that are exploding in a certain sense. We really don't know all that much about both from a field perspective, the research that we have, as well as organizations. And if you're developing talent strategies or market strategies, there is, there are significant gaps to be filled. But if you give me a moment to just indulge the inner historian around this approach, the next slide, or the slide that you're looking at, is kind of I think an encapsulation of how TMC and the various different tools had to evolve with the evolving challenges in the marketplace and within organizations. So when, in a certain sense, this entire industry around intercultural effectiveness was deeply steeped in an internationalization movement, all of a sudden we discover that we export our services and goods, and their markets somewhere else and customers somewhere else, and we need to understand and prepare ourselves for differences, differences in suppliers, in buyers, in distributors, and so forth. And in the very beginning, there was this intense focus on, explain to me, or I need to understand a different country. And so we had this temptation to look at cultural boundaries as national boundaries. And this is, I guess, the anthropologist in me, that view is extremely limiting and minimizing, because, of course, national boundaries are not cultural boundaries, they're power boundaries, and cultural boundaries may look more like weather maps, actually, and somehow our national idea of culture doesn't quite coincide with how culture actually operates. So that became actually much more apparent when companies now globalized, right? And certainly when it then extended into the conversations around diversity and multiculturalism in organizations, where it became clear that we cannot just simply create country-level descriptions of the other and assume that they will apply or be meaningful to our interactions with a specific individual that might have a different background. So we needed to find a way of doing justice to the individual expression of cultural orientations, and that's where we generated the cultural orientations indicator. The cultural orientations model is based on well-established dimensions of cultural difference, coming from that national paradigm, but the cultural orientations indicator is helping us to individualize this and to discover cultural orientations in ourselves and in others, not assuming that the passport you carry is a reliable indicator of how you operate and what you value and how you operate in an intercultural environment. And then, of course, we said, how can we create a system out of that helps organizations manage and orient themselves in a diverse and multicultural environment where both the national and the individual levels of culture are present but insufficient, where we needed to add a view of identity group. We needed to address how does this work in teams, and how do teams actually create a culture. How do organizations create and develop their culture out of this multiculturalism? And also, how do we within different business units and functions actually represent different cultural orientations that we now need to reconcile increasingly well in this to meet the complex challenges. So essentially we have evolved this thinking significantly since 1987 into what we would now call the cultural orientations approach. And maybe we can just go to the next slide briefly, because what we also needed to do, much in line with this thinking that I just articulated, that cultural boundaries are not necessarily national boundaries, we needed to develop a differentiated perspective that puts culture right in the middle and say, and do justice to the fact that culture exists at multiple levels, and that we perhaps want to focus on these 6 levels. They're probably more than 6, but I think the unit of application that we gave to it is by focusing on helping organizations on that individual level of culture, on the identity group level of culture, on the team level, the functional level, the organization level, and the national level of culture. So I think we needed something that addresses culture and at all of those levels, not just get stuck in one view of what culture is and one treatment of that. So what does that mean? I mean, when we say we don't prioritize any of these levels, we kind of look at which level is most relevant when we work with clients and we understand their specific needs and challenges. But at the core, there is a view of culture, how culture works, that is essential to this work. And maybe we can go to the next slide for that real briefly. And this may seem like a mouthful, and if it strikes you as a somewhat German sentence in length, that's no accident. But we can look at culture as a pattern of associations that exists, that we make, our societies make, between behavior, beliefs and assumptions about that behavior, and the emotions we feel as a result of that association. So if we believe that a given behavior is respectful, respect and respectful treatment is generally associated with a positive emotional response. So our culture tells us this and that behavior means respect, and respect is positive. So our norms, namely the behaviors, and our values are somehow aligned here, and our societies and our social groups tend to expect, reinforce, and reward that association. And so that might be a very simple way of looking at how culture operates. It is what is expected, reinforced, and rewarded by and within a particular group. And it's precisely that pattern of association. And interestingly, you know, the conscious and unconscious parts of that association that we need to analyze, understand, discover, and also shift if we want to build those dynamic adaptability skills that both Karen and Lynn talked about earlier. So this is actually a very practical way of looking at culture, and those patterns of association exist at all of those 6 levels: the national, the organizational, the team, the interpersonal, the identity group level. So I think that's a view that is core to this particular perspective that is very, I think on one hand very sound, but also extremely practical.
And speaking of how practical and theoretical our approach is, question that many of us must have around the paradox. Is it important for us to really understand large structural theories about culture, or is it more important for us to actually look at how it works in practice in terms of what kind of behavior is expected and how will you be rewarded? And a lot of our model, and I'm sure this is true for all of you, we are increasingly finding ourselves in a world of paradoxes. and you've seen this already today in our discussion, is should our focus be looking forward on strategic performance? Should we be studying the global structural forces that are on the horizon or that we are currently involved in? Or is it really important for us to really look at what's going on with each of us from a value perspective or our belief structures, and how important we should explore the self, for example? And a lot of what we're looking at and what we're finding that the true competency is in being able to actually live with the paradox and actually engage with the paradox itself. And this does require, on our cultural perspective here, is that it is really what we find ironic, that the more that we have responsibilities at the larger global structural level, the actual importance it is to really understand who we are and to really spend some self-development time on understanding our conditioned mind, and where was this actually conditioned for us in terms of our value system and how we actually reward others. And in particular, in terms of psychology, what we're looking at, especially in the world of negotiation, is the more understanding we have of ourselves and the more understanding we have of others, we actually have what happens in our brain is insight. That is, we move from being purely egoistic in terms of looking at the problems of the world, or we think of our situation as the most important one. We are the center of the universe, to we actually engage with others by understanding and increasing our sense of reality. And in many ways, it's actually psychologically, with this kind of insight, we move from being more egoistic in terms of our behavior and our values, and we become more sociocentric. That is, I see that my individual conditioning and value system has been conditioned by my own experience, but then I can also understand the similarities and differences of others. And this actually has an enormous shift in terms of how we actually orient ourselves in the world. And we understand that we are actually living in a social situation, and it requires today even more to be able to adapt to new relationships where others have had very different cultural experiences, whether it's organizational or national. We also are in extremely dynamic team situations, and increasingly we're finding as companies themselves become more global, it requires much more understanding of ourselves in each of our business units or our functional units to be able to understand the rest of the business units in our organization, so we can work together as one sociocentric group to actually deliver to our clients and customers across the globe, because we need to engage with all of those business functions across the organization in order to really be successful in the global space. So we find that this work that we do actually moves us across this continuum of looking at ourselves in a more egoistic way or a more ethnocentric way, which is to basically deny what the differences might be or minimize the differences, because we have found that, and I'm sure many of you see this too, there's a very judgmental or thumbnail sketch of who the Indians are or who the Brits are. And what we find is that makes it very difficult to be able to be extremely dynamic, build working trust, and create new options, and to be able to move quickly with each other. So this particular very practical work of understanding the self and understanding others helps us move to what we would like to call this is a very non-judgmental way of looking at differences and accepting the differences, using style switching behaviors, for example, to adapt. And in many of the cases we're working with now, it's taken many years to move from accepting the differences across business units or national cultures to some real skills and adaptation. But today we're actually seeing a very interesting approaches to integration. That is, we've created a new culture. And the culture is neither, let's say, US or Australian. It is a new culture integrated with what's best at both of those locations, the nexus of those locations, to create something that's much more responsive and agile. So that takes us toward the next dimension, in terms of looking at the ways that we can actually increase our key cultural skills. And Lynn, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Love the way that you speak to the ethnocentrist and ethno-relative construct. It's key and essential and more a part of the conversation in business these days, especially at the board level, where they're looking at the next evolution of the organization and what skills and what capabilities do their leaders need to have. So really excited about these next four cultural skills, again, moving into the strategic performance framework. Again, we get into the cultural skills, and there are four of them. Let me just talk high level about those, because I think they're critical in just a good understanding and foundation before we move into the actual case studies. So the key cultural skills, if I can start you on the far left side, cultural due diligence. This is where we should, if we don't always start, this is where we should start. This is a great place to level set with the environment that you're having to go into. If you're looking to enter a new market, that due diligence is critical. There are a lot of our clients actually have divisions in the organization that are research and development, new market entry divisions, risk assessment, you name it. Those divisions go by many different names, but they're really looking at preparing for the new environment that they're trying to enter. And one of the things that are often forgotten in terms of preparing and at the organizational level for entering new markets is upskilling the leadership, upskilling the staff, upskilling the individuals, the people that actually make that operation work and make it successful, of course. So that cultural due diligence is not only at the organizational level a necessary and very vital component of preparing to enter a new market, but the individual level capability upskilling that is necessary really does need to happen. And that's at the individual level and at the team level. So quite often it's forgotten about. The due diligence can look like, just going into the Cultural Navigator and digging deep inside of some of the country information that's available in there, to talking to other people, talking to other organizations across your network that have entered that market, and learn from their mistakes, and learn from their pain points, learn from their opportunities that they were able to take advantage of. So that's due diligence. And then there's always a kind of a deciding point after due diligence is done, is when you enter the new market, and specifically at the individual level. This is where we see it coming into play more and more. And that is, if the individual that you're working with is capable, or it's feasible for that person to adapt, to engage in dialogue with you and explore or mutually adapt their style to yours, that's where we engage with cultural dialogue all the way across the grid here to the right. So cultural dialogue is that mutual adaptation, the exchange of ideas, the discovery, the mutual discovery of a process that's going to get to action and to productivity and to success much faster. And so if at the decision point you find that, well, it doesn't seem like it's very feasible for the client that I'm working with to adapt to my style, so I'm going to develop a different behavioral approach. I'm going to try something different with this individual. I'm going to show up in a way that makes them more comfortable, to make them more at ease. And that's, bringing in emotional intelligence. That's being able to read the situation very clearly. That's what some people call speed reading of culture, the ability to identify the body language, the intonation, the speech patterns, the detail orientation or the systemic orientation of the individual that you're working with, and dynamically shift. So bringing a cultural agility or a cultural dynamicism to the engagement. That's what we call style switching, so using a different behavioral approach to accomplish your goals. And then, of course, at the very bottom is the cultural mentoring, and it's critical for us to be able to identify not only when to reach out and hopefully ask for some mentoring, but also to identify when you could be value add to others based on your experience, based on the things that you have tried and perhaps gained some great knowledge from, whether it was successful or not. You have the knowledge, and perhaps there are opportunities for you to help others through that knowledge that you've gained. So those are the 4 key cultural skills, and to Karen and Jorg's point, these are quite valuable in terms of being able to navigate the different situations, the VUCA world that we are dynamically having to adjust to on a day-by-day basis. And if we could go to the next slide, I want to just take 1 minute and just make sure that we are firmly rooted in what we call the cultural due diligence cornerstone, which is the COI, really getting ourselves ready for that engagement and developing our own self-awareness. And that's what the COI is intended to do. It's a psychometrically validated instrument that is intended to measure your cultural preferences. And in a work style context, it's a shared language that is non-judgmental. It's neutral in nature so that you can identify the different work style preferences that are coming into play and have a productive conversation around that instead of perhaps a polarizing conversation that pits one side against the other. We want to be more inclusive in our vocabulary so that we can harness the energies and the diverse perspectives that are present within our teams, within our interpersonal communication, and then at the organizational level as well. And we divide the COI into 3 different what we call dimensions. One is the interaction style, or the blue area, how we interact with others. The thinking style, or the green, how we process information. And then over on the left, the orange, the sense of self, is really how we view our own identity and how we're motivated in the workplace as well. So that helps us get to a really important kind of foundation so that we can move into developing strategic results and taking those capabilities that we have developed over our experiences and through our experiences into a more influential approach to others, because most of us have to work with people that we have no authority over, and we want to influence them to partner with us in a way that is going to be productive and effective for us both. We want to be able to collaborate effectively with our partners across perhaps a merged organizational structure, perhaps across functions, and be a great collaborator and value add member of the organization or of the partnership that you might be in. To negotiate more effectively at the table and to mutually work through some of those business negotiations that we're tasked with that perhaps haven't gone as well as they could have, and we've learned and we want to be better every single time we sit at the negotiation table. And then finally, the absolute core essential skill of communicating. How do we adapt our communication style on an individual basis so that we can be most effective? So I want to take a moment and really think through some of the applications of this. And all 3 of us have come with an example that we're really looking forward to sharing with you. And I'm going to hand this over to Karen, because Karen, you're on the first one with global negotiations. So perhaps I hand it over to you, Karen.
Great. And what I wanted to do here was just to share with you 2 different company situations that I've been working with in the last couple of years. And we would say the focus here is in terms of global negotiation. And I mean by that, the focus was to learn a lot about negotiating with those who are very different than ourselves. And that means not only large contracts, and in both of these cases, because these companies were going global, they had to negotiate often with governments and different government agencies just to have access to the products and the services that they were offering. So it not only is at the large-scale contract, but also in terms of negotiating with talent, with retaining talent, with the kind of global teams that were being created as a result, and the kind of negotiations that were taking place within each of the companies across the business functions. So when I'm talking about the application of negotiation, it's at all of these levels, and at any time that there's something that you need and you have to work through others in order to accomplish it, you are in a negotiation situation. And there's something very specific about global. So for these two companies, one company was primarily a U.S. domestic company for many, many years, and now is moving, because of global growth patterns, looking at the global markets. And a lot of the feedback they were getting from customers was that the fly-in, fly-out strategy of global in those domestic markets wasn't going to create the kind of trust or the presence that was going to be required to win contracts. So a lot of due diligence went into this. As Lynn pointed out before, you have your company BI, business intelligence units, and risk assessment units, and all the market intelligence and government intelligence was taking place. But they actually discovered that the focus on the cultural due diligence in terms of how does the government actually work in Australia or in the UK or in Saudi Arabia. So the application of entering and working with governments and militaries across the globe was quite unique. And then there was a lot of work we've done over the years doing a lot of executive training around discussion around the sensitivities and creating workshops where there could be discussions between the US group and the Saudi Arabian group, for example, to talk about some of the sensitivities that would not necessarily be even found in the textbooks, but to get those on the ground to really just have some discussions about the sensitivities and to be cautious and to be a little more professional about the dialogue and the presentations, for example. And then a lot of work done in both of these companies around practices around style switching and what that would mean. And of course, all of the work had to do with looking at our own cultural conditioning and then how to style switch. And then there's very formal and informal programs on mentoring both of these companies. And what we have found, just in 2 years, the contract captures have gone very well. And what we've also seen is that the kind of services that are now being offered in the international or in the global context are something new that they would not have thought of originally. In many cases, a lot of our companies start out with looking at trying to get market entry on products, but with additional dialogue and actual understanding of the cultural context and what the needs are in these locations, they've actually created a lot of new services that they hadn't really thought of or seen before because they've increased their dialogue. And what we've seen is that they're doing much better now on recruitment and retention in these regional markets. I think one of the biggest things we're finding of companies going global is to have the talent that is going to be able to work between the corporate headquarters, whether it's in Norway or in the US, with the regional markets in China and in Thailand, for example. So these very practical steps are increasing the impact in terms of retention and winning contracts in these locations. So we see great success of applying the 4 key cultural skills.
And that meta perspective is so important. Sometimes we only think of the 4 key cultural skills at the individual level. And Karen, what you just beautifully illustrated, what is the impact of applying the 4 key cultural skills at the organizational level and being able to strategically, focus on one or the other. Really, really powerful example there.
Yeah, that's why the 3 of us have talked a lot about this being a true strategic performance model because it has that impact on organizational results.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And Jorg, let me do a quick check-in with you. Did you want to talk about example 2 or example 3?
I'm happy to talk about either, actually. I mean, I can talk about that. Maybe, I mean, it doesn't matter. You let me know.
Why don't I take two and I have you take three? How does that sound, Jörg?
Gladly. And before you do that, let me just also encourage some questions from our audience. I mean, as we're sketching these, and then obviously the point also is to launch into a little bit of your questions. So send us some questions through the GoToWebinar if you like, or we can have some time to discuss them, of course.
Absolutely. Yes, please use the question box for any questions that you have. We are going to reserve about 10 minutes at, about 5 minutes at the end of the session for some brief questions, but feel free to ask those and we will we'll pull those up as we're dynamically presenting. So I wanted to just highlight the center case study, which is really a focus on developing inclusive norms. And this is, again, at the organizational level where, something went wrong. Specifically in this situation, one of our clients lost a huge multi-million-dollar project in pre-sale. So as the technologists, actually the engineers, were in discussions and trying to, kind of work out what it would look like for them to engage vendor to supplier or to client, the communication broke down to such an extent that the actual sale eroded. And the CEO came into the office of the HR, global HR head and said, something's got to change. This is not going to happen again. We lost a multi-million-dollar deal at the engineering level, and we could not recoup it. We could not recover from the disconnect that happened in even the pre-sale event and the process. So one of the things that this global HR head did was really to enact a organizational initiative to create a common language. And you know how powerful that common language is. It's hard to identify until you have it. And once you have it, you understand the benefit of it. But the process of developing a common language across the entire organization is arduous, and it's a project that takes a long period of time. It takes a far-reaching vision in order to affect it and in order to actually make the organizational shift happen at the global level and not just at the headquarter, pushing it out to the subsidiaries, rather organically growing it from, subsidiary on up and top down as well at the same time. So what happened is the CEO championed it with the C-suite, made sure that all of the leaders understood it and walked the talk, and then the HR global head had the arduous task of developing champions across the world. And because the C-suite was behind it, the regional leads were behind it as well, and they came on board. They understood the value of it. They understood the business imperative as well, meaning it impacted the bottom line. And so it created this organizational attention towards creating a common vocabulary around differences. And so because of that, they saw a very specific shift from regional cultural preferences to global cultural thinking, so that non-judgmental vocabulary enabled a conversation to happen across the enterprise that raise the level of awareness around the differences, around the energy, around the synergies that were available to the organization and had up to that point been untapped and unrealized. They saw a marked decrease in the cultural mishaps and an increased positive team and organizational report through the 2-year cycle of employee satisfaction surveys. They looked at the anecdotal remarks made of managers in 360 reviews, and they were able to actually calculate a marked improvement in organizational engagement. And so the other part that they noticed was the enhanced style switching, abilities and empathy necessary to identify when you have to style switch and when it's appropriate. And then finally, the increase in cultural dialogue really affected the inclusive workplace that needed to emerge in order for them to win those competitive bids that they were after. And they did see an increased bid win rate. That was about a 2 to 3 year organizational shift that was necessary, and they have maintained it. They have organizational champions across the globe that are delivering both at the local as well as the global level. Again, the common vocabulary being the central focal point, and again, the COI being one of those opportunities to engage in that non-judgmental vocabulary. So, truly developing inclusive norms at the organizational level was the goal of this organization, and they were able to do it. It did take a while, though. So, just a thought for you. Love to hear any questions you might have about how that was enacted while I hand it over to Jorg to share that last example.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. And I'll make this, very short so that we also allow for some questions. And one came in, actually. I'm just looking at this. One of you asked this question. We know that knowledge is not enough. So what is the process for building capacity and more complex meaning making? And I think in your case that you just shared, actually in all of our cases here, that was a critical component for success, because we know knowledge does not yield the necessary or the desired behavioral change. There are other things that we need to work on, and a couple of things. We need to create the right context, and we need to work at deeper levels emotionally and with people around their values, their drivers, and really get into how we make sense of the world. To create shared meaning, we need to talk about how we individually make sense. And maybe this third example of influencing in a global matrix environment is actually a good one, because, and I'll make it really short to enable questions, but the COA is configured to work with those implicit, unconscious, emotional connectedness associations that drive our behavior. So surfacing them, identifying how the gaps that we are creating, right, between how we desire to work and collaborate and how we actually collaborate and work, and surfacing the incentive structures, the expectations, the rewards, and the reinforcements that keep us from actually living our values is actually a very key part here, and that's a collaborative part. In this particular instance, that had to be a leadership development process that provided the context and the frame to actually use action learning as a way of getting leaders into the habit of observing and analyzing and assessing these type of cultural gaps, and then actually modeling for the others in themselves the ability to learn and style switch. And that was a deep process that was enabled through coaching and facilitation, as well as peer coaching here. And by leaders doing that work themselves, they could show up differently and lead their people through an analogous process of growth and development, which actually then yielded some significant transformations. In this case, it improved the individual leadership acumen to operate well within this global matrix environment that the company has created, and that is a challenge for probably all of us at certain levels. But meaningfully and being able to track greater levels of effectiveness and improvement was actually the outcome here. So we were also able to measure some of the impact. So we could probably talk about these cases for a lengthy period of time, but maybe this is a good enough summary of this particular case to help us get into a few questions that you might have.
Yeah, and Jorg, I see one question, and perhaps I could defer to Karen to see if she has a thought here, and that is, what were the key strategies that helped them be successful? And Mitch, thanks for that question. I wonder which strategy specifically you were talking about, but maybe I could defer to you, Karen, from your example. Were there some key strategies that made the difference to success, or you know, maybe having to go back to the planning, the drawing board for the strategy that they were deploying in order to make the negotiations more successful, Karen?
Thanks, Mitch. That's $1 million question, isn't it? It's fascinating to me because it comes back to the question of paradox. Is that when I noticed that in the companies that I've worked with, when there was both the structural changes that actually had to make some real organizational structural changes to facilitate better communication and reward structure within the organization. If the functions were meant to work with each other, then they needed to be rewarded, and they also needed to be connected in a way that they could facilitate their research with each other, for example. And then the other is that, ironically, the better that I saw in an organizational investment in leadership development, in particular, I find that one of the key components is it's almost like moving into increased consciousness of who we are as individuals and who we are as an organization. And what I find that the more clarity there is on the individual level, on the functional level, and the kind of brand position that a company takes, that kind of clarity and awareness about themselves helps them to be able to engage in a more trustworthy way with others. So I would say it's at both levels. The structural level, some real help to encourage facilitation and engagement and inclusion, and then this kind of personal development and a real commitment by the organization to leadership development.
Well, and we would love to continue. As you can see, we have so much to give. We are at the top of the hour, and I just want to give my warmest thank you to both Karen and Jorg. Our labor of love in writing the Strategic Performance Framework book, the Cultural Orientations Guide version 6, has really been a labor of love, and certainly we'd love to continue to talk about it. So look for our next TMC roundtable coming up soon. Until then, please do keep in touch with us. Please continue to look to TM Corp, where we post our white papers and our thought leadership. The Maximizing Business Results book is available on Amazon. We welcome your feedback on the book as well, and please do keep in touch with us. Jorg, Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Lakeisha and Jeffrey, for production as well. Bye-bye.